Hello, everyone, and welcome into Fridays with Phil. I'm Phil Mayo, and I would like to share with you 5 minutes of biblical insight to help you along the way. Last week, we looked at Ezra 1:1-6, and how God moved the heart of King Cyrus to return the exiles to Judah to rebuild the temple. This week, our focus is Ezra 3-6 and how to respond when opposition comes. When the exiles returned to Jerusalem, the first thing they did was rebuild the temple altar to restore sacrifice to Yahweh. Ezra 3:3 says, despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord. Listen carefully. Despite their fear, they did what God sent them back to do. Once the altar is restored, the exiles proceed to build the temple. Ezra 4:1 says, the enemies of Judah and Benjamin, end quote, came down to offer their help. However, the exiles refused their help, perhaps recognizing their duplicity. So listen once again to Ezra 4:4. Their enemies set out to discourage them and make them afraid. The number one weapon the enemy uses to keep us from doing God's will is fear. Fear is the opposite of faith. Anyone who has experienced fear knows how debilitating it is. The enemy's second weapon is discouragement and goes hand in hand with fear. This past January 2024, Jolene and I traveled to teach in Ethiopia. For several weeks before we left, I was suffering with debilitating back pain. I have had chronic back problems many years, but I had learned how to manage it fairly well. During the weeks before departure, it flared up constantly and wouldn't get better. I was concerned that this chronic problem had taken a turn for the worse. It was very discouraging. Sitting, walking, just moving was a chore. I cried out to the Lord constantly for answers. I knew I had 5 weeks of travel and 50 hours of teaching in front of me. In fact, 2024 was scheduled to be the busiest travel year of our ministry. The weekend before we left, my back flared up again. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to go. This is what God called me to do. So I went, pain or no pain. However, God had said something to me before we left that stayed lodged in my mind. It's opposition, he said. I confess that I tend to be a bit naive when it comes to the tactics of our enemy. I know that the Bible frequently talks about Satan's opposition to God and his people. However, my Western mindset tends to discount the spiritual realm as uninvolved in our daily lives. Like the exiles, I learned that whenever you're doing something for God, the enemy will show up. The first evening we arrived in Ethiopia, I was still in pain. So, Jolene and I prayed. I was so discouraged that I was in tears. I said to God, am I really not going to be able to do what you called me to do? I heard God say in my heart, have your students pray for you, and I will deliver you. The first day of class, I had all 18 of my students gather in the center of the room and lay hands on me. I'm happy to say God delivered me. The rest of the trip was pain-free. There are two responses to opposition. We can shrink back or press ahead. The exiles shrank back and stopped building the temple. God sent them prophets to remind them of his word. In response, they restarted work on the temple. Their enemies came back, but this time, God turned the situation around. The king ordered, let the temple be rebuilt. Do not interfere with the work. Their expenses are to be fully paid. Because of obedience, the scripture says, quote, they finished building the temple according to the command of God, end quote. It's our obedience that brings victory, even if circumstances look discouraging. press ahead. Circumstances don't determine the outcome. Our faith does. Next week, we'll begin a new series, Reading Revelation Right. I hope you'll join me. Thank you, and God bless you.